Hello, all you daring souls, and welcome to the Mixed Up Mystics podcast. This is part 2 of our interview with Jason Elmore, and today we're kind of widening the lens out to look at the relevance of the church in America and how that's changed over the last 50 years. I think it's a conversation you're really going to enjoy. I do want to encourage you to listen to the whole thing because by the time we get to the end, there's some really cool and important stuff that I think comes out, and I think you're really going to appreciate it. So let's get on with it.
This podcast is a presentation of Pioneer Dream, celebrating 30 years of moving stories for our corporate, nonprofit, and entertainment partners. We invite you, fellow misfits, to join the conversation with text, emails, or just messages in the comment section below. As always, you can share this podcast with anyone you think would get it by sending the link now. Thanks for listening.
So let's widen out the lens a little bit and try and give us the cultural reference for where the church was and what was happening in that moment, what the church looked like, what its presence in our country was like in that moment.
Very present, right? More so than now. It was.
No, I would just say that the church was doing the church thing. It was before the religious right. That concept was developed. There was a distinct separation between church and the church affecting culture.
Right.
Okay.
So people stayed in the buildings, did their trips, did their programs, did that sort of thing, did their worship the way they did their worship. People would speak in terms of, man, that's good, or that's really great, or that church is really growing, or that church is, quote, on fire for God. But none of it had any impact on culture.
And it was a time where the term sacred and secular.
Yes,
so it was
that's a good
very
point.
much separate, right?
Yeah, that's a good word. So you had sacred and you had secular. So for the church to be outside of its building, it would be kind of secularizing the church, so to speak.
Yeah. So we kept them separated, as we
Oh,
say.
yeah.
Well, so
definitely.
At what point do you start to see, come out of the 70s, you go into the 80s, at what point do you start to see this movement within the church to kind of separate itself out culturally? Like, there was one thing to say, there's a division between state and church and all that kind of stuff, and not to mix politics and all those things. There was another thing to kind of start saying, well, this other thing that we're separated from is evil. It's the world, and we need to start being our own kind of culture, our own movement. So when did that start happening?
That was happening early on.
I think we really sealed the deal. I mean, just from my observation, would have been in the 80s. It was sort of like the world. And now, beyond it just being sacred and secular, the church culture became, you've got to separate yourself out from this. This is all evil.
Yes, come out from among them.
And youth group was your place to be. Christian music became.
It feels like that's kind of when we start marrying politics a little bit too. It's like we come out of the 70s and the Jesus movement and whatever that was.
Were you part of the Jesus movement at all, or did you observe any of that?
Well, I observed some of that. It was, kind of concurrent. There was some stuff happening in California.
Right.
On the beaches. There were hippies who had, done drugs, tried everything, and they didn't find that comfort that we were talking about. But then they did. Through the Jesus movement. So there were some services and gatherings that really didn't have a liturgy, but had spirit and gave hope to people.
And it feels like by the time we get to the 80s and we're kind of trying to recover from the 70s and we're trying to recover from Carter and all that kind of stuff, it feels like there's a movement in there about the time that Reagan becomes president where the politicians are really appealing to families. They're really appealing to churches. They're really trying to cement themselves.
Family first, that type of.
And in somewhere in there, the program becomes about the church itself. And then by the time we hit, late 80s, early 90s, it's like, you're either in or you're out. It's you can't mix the two worlds anymore.
Yeah. So I had this flashback just as you were saying that. To my first consciousness of politics and the church was that we had some people that were teachers or leaders in our youth group in Tulsa, and they wanted us to go see at the Civic Center. Who's the senator from Arizona, Barry Goldwater.
Okay, sure.
Yeah.
So he took our Sunday school class.
Wow. And this when you were a teenager.
Yeah. And
Okay.
I'm 13, 14,
Wow.
1964. And we go see Barry Goldwater.
Mm-hmm.
So I have that connection in 1964 that, okay, these people, they think it's important or something, and yet I consider these people to be, somewhat believers. And
Yeah.
anyway, I didn't get anything out of the
But
Goldwater
the
thing.
connection that they were making between spirituality and politics.
Yeah, possibly
Yeah.
something.
No,
That.
that's interesting.
Yeah, but as far as the other, as far as really what I would say now, co-opting the church, probably began, I don't know.
The 2000s? Do you feel
No,
like?
well, I mean, that's when it really happened. But the dangerous thing was here was the term moral majority.
Oh, yeah.
The idea is most of the folks out there are moral. And if you want things to stay moral, you need to vote this way.
Right.
Okay. Yeah.
Right.
And so I don't know what year. It's all, big smear now. But that sort of thinking,
Yeah.
getting a voting block. And because we talk about people that feel like they're moral,
Yeah.
maybe a lot of them are churchgoers.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you come into this thing where, at the beginning of it, churches and home, churches at home and churches in the church. It's not really intermingling it. And then somewhere between there and maybe the mid to late 80s, when you start encouraging word in your first church, then there becomes this thing where Christianity has become a culture.
Yes.
Yes.
And I can remember, so, encouraging word was never a one issue church or anything like that. But I remember those early years and conversations, that we had about this culture of Christianity versus this practice of Christianity or this relationship with Christianity. So what do you remember about that moment? What stands out to you about where things were at that time?
The church culture it came, I think, on the heels of the charismatic movement.
Okay.
And so you had churches that were kind of modifying that or shaping it or ameliorating it. I've been waiting to use that
Nicely
word.
done. I'll give everybody a minute to go look that
I'm
up.
not sure I've ever
Pause
heard that word, but I believe you.
Sure.
Well,
Okay.
you say it with confidence, and whatever. But it was, I would say, kind of softening the edges of it. So the church culture, we had, TBN, the network,
Right.
Was huge.
Yeah. It's probably what you and Mom found with the foil on your antenna. That's TV, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Channel 3.
You could find that anywhere, man.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
I felt like the church culture and the so-called evangelical or even charismatic part of the church, they all watch some of the same shows on TBN.
Okay, some of the same. 700 Club.
Yeah,
Right,
700
some of
Clubs, Fire by Night.
Yeah, I remember all of that. Yeah.
Yes.
So I grew up.
Lots of people with very big hair.
Yeah,
Oh,
that's right.
yeah.
But
Lots
that
of
was
makeup.
the whole culture that we were. So my mom and dad, the way that I remember it, were always very sincere in what they believed, but we were still part of that Christian
Yeah, we were.
culture. Of course, we were taught to be kind to everyone and accepting,
Yeah.
more so than a lot of people. But we were part of that, and
Yeah.
and the big thing with it was there was a separatist
Yeah,
Yes.
part
still.
of it.
Oh, man.
It was, you've got to protect yourself from these other people that are
Yeah.
in quote the world.
Yes.
And and you would always teach, from, was it First Peter, I can't remember, that we're aliens, we're in the world
Yeah.
but not of the world.
Right.
And
Right.
so Dad would always temper that with stuff
Right.
that he was reading on his own, but that was it. It was, you had your own music, you had your own social group, that was
Oh,
your
yeah.
youth group,
Yeah.
and you had your own television.
Let's see. I
TVN,
want to talk about this for a minute.
Yeah.
The word derivative.
Yeah.
I believe that the church at that time was very derivative. They would take something that they saw, quote, outside of the church that was popular,
Right.
like a movie. And then they would make a movie based on or derived from what they saw the, quote, world liked.
Yes.
So they Christianized it, sold tickets again to the churchgoers, and then say, kind of look at us. So they say, here's a Christian movie. Well, here we had Christian bands, you know, that kicked off all of that.
Yeah, exactly.
And some of them good, but it's all derivative. It's derived from the world system.
Yeah.
And you say, come, you know, like I had a conversation with my son, Jared, you know, years ago. And he says, well, Dad, why, you know, we have a Christian comedian here. Well, you can go see a comedian anywhere out there. So that's an example of being derivative. Yeah. So we say, come see the Christian comedian.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, that's so interesting. I was talking to a friend yesterday, as a matter of fact, Brent, and we were talking about this concept a little bit in a different context. But you know, we're talking about how, as in terms of derivative, in terms of modeling ourselves after the world, that's exactly where the church ended up going. So they said we need growth. So we're going to call in people who are making businesses grow and
Church
ask
growth
them,
specialists.
how do we make this thing grow?
Yeah.
And so it wasn't about, you know, staying true to the tenets of Christianity or staying true to, quote, the mission of Christianity. We started running the church like a business. And that required us to have a certain, you know, thing. And you have to have a mission that keeps people on track. You have to, you know, there has to be an us and a them to make that thing work. And and then so somewhere in there we went from Jesus movement and charismania a little bit and into this separatist world where we had to have our own culture and it was very much us versus them. And they were on the outside, we were on the outside.
Hello Christian t-shirts, you know, Christian,
the old Christian
bumper
t-shirts.
stickers. You know.
And then we would take the teachings from the scriptures and we would isolate elements of that and then really hone in on parts of that that kind of just, you know, create a more separate, but we were scared of the outside world.
Yes.
Right.
We had to protect our children from the outside world.
I think that was a lot of it. I mean, I think fear has always played in it. And now that we have a kid, you do understand that.
Sure.
You think, well, are we doing the right thing?
Yeah.
So people would say, oh, well, send your kids to the Christian movie.
Yes.
Let your kids listen to the Christian bands. Let's keep them safe.
Let's go roller skate with Christians.
With Christians.
Church night at the roller rink and church night at the new theater.
And so what may have started out as, you know, some good motivation to give your kids good entertainment options that are wholesome, unfortunately turned into further separating the groups of people.
Right.
So there are your Christians and your non-Christians. And then at church, you might have to, or at school, you know, you need to be really ready. You got to be powered up because you may be called on to make a stand.
Right.
Oh, about making a stand.
Yeah, I've made a couple and I'm embarrassed about it still.
You had to take your city and or your school for Christ.
I don't know what that looks like.
I never saw a city taken for Christ, but we kept wanting to do it. And I don't know where they were taking it. I don't know where they were taking it for Christ, but they were taking it.
I hosted a prayer meeting outside school that I was part of that. People to, and Jay, and I'm still embarrassed about that. Not because prayer is wrong, but the idea that it further, you know, you're doing your best with what you know at the time.
You take a stand, you
it
make
was like
a
some
boycott,
people pray and some don't. That's right.
Right.
You take a stand, you take a boycott, and it was kind of the season of that.
So I'm consolidating this, you know, for the sake of the podcast, but you know, I remember what stood out to me, you know, when I first made contact with Jason through you and started coming to services at Encouraging Word and all that, was that it was life-giving. And so here was this thing that was not built on formula. Here was a thing that was not built on the
liturgy
structure. Here was a thing that was life-giving and was separate from the rest of the kind of church movement I was seeing, you know, that I was participating in, but also that I was seeing around me. Yeah. And it's funny because obviously we called things by different names, you know, denominations, but the reality is, like you said, I mean, I came from what would be defined as the liturgical church, being Catholic, but like you say, even the Baptists had a liturgy. They just didn't think they did, you know? And so, you know, when encouraging word comes on the scene and people come to a service and it's like a life-giving breath, you're like, oh, I don't have to jump to these hoops. Oh, I can be honest about this. Oh, we can do this. And so it grows quickly. And so we get into this thing where it kind of explodes. And, at some point, we're somewhere in that kind of 500 person, 600 person range. And like we've talked about before, it's kind of a mega church in our area before there's a mega church. So there's blacked out ceilings and TV screens and all that kind of stuff. Yeah. So then, because, I think this part's amazing, but you've always been really responsive to whatever inspiration happens in that moment and trusted that, which I think is an amazing thing.
Have to.
Yeah.
Without inspiration, I am crippled.
So we're in this moment and, where the services look a little bit like, maybe a multi-hour thing where you're doing a lot of music and it's a big rock band and then there's a teaching thing portion of that might be long. So it's not really nothing to be there for maybe 2 to 3 hours depending on what's happening on a day. Yeah. And then something kind of starts to change. So tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah. So what happened was...
What had happened? Okay.
Yeah, I felt like that after we'd been doing Encouraging Word for several years, that new Christians kind of became old Christians, and that we had our own kind of liturgy. And that liturgy was you gather people in, you have really bombastic, really full opening sort of thing.
Rock band.
Rock
praise band.
And I had praise band and all of that. And then we had our thing where I think some of this came from the TV Christian culture.
Yeah.
That we were derivative on that in that we began to see the evil one as someone to go after.
Yeah,
someone.
That was a big part of the 80s.
Spiritual
warfare movement.
Yeah, spiritual warfare. I just call it a spiritual warfare movement. And that was going on. Anyway, people yelling, people shouting, raising their fists at the devil. People organizing prayer meetings. It had to start at 5 a.m.
Oh, geez.
Even God is up then.
Yeah, the devil's not awake at 5 a.m.
Yes,
how are you going to fight him?
all this sort of thing, going on. And people loving their praise, because we did have some great musicians.
Yeah, we did.
Some great music, some great spirit. But people began to love that, and I would say it kind of became an idol.
Yeah.
Right. And then I felt or understood in my consciousness, it's the only way I can say this, and I'm reluctant to say I heard God said to me, but it's different for everybody, but you know it, and He is communicating in your consciousness. And He began to say and put on my heart that we really need to go after the one. To the good shepherd will leave 99 in safe pasture and go after the one sheep. So along with that, I began hearing that you won't be a Sunday church.
Oh, wow. Yeah. And here we were all so comfortable. We had like a cool coffee shop. We had amazing music, and God's presence would come in. You feel encouraged and pumped up,
you had a coffee shop, had gift shop, and, all this sort of stuff.
All the stuff that's popular now. Youth group.
And
food
all
pantry.
Of that. And the food pantry, of course. And so it was as if God were saying, and He was saying, I am jealous for this. I want to replace the Sunday morning experience with me.
Yeah.
I want to be worshiped, not the Sunday morning experience.
Yeah.
And would you be willing to do whatever it would take to be with me? Would you be willing to do it if you didn't have this huge music dynamic experience for an hour and a half? Would you be willing to do that if I made smaller windows for you to go through? So we began to change some of the services. We changed the way we set up the worship thing. We had small windows of worship.
Yeah.
And it's kind of like, if you're going to get in here, you got to get in here and do that.
Yeah, you got to focus
Yeah,
in.
and you got to look for me, seek me.
Yeah, it's a little bit more acoustic. I mean,
Yes,
we're simplifying.
There are a couple of things that really stand out to me from all that. One is they weren't calling it that at the time, but it was our first experience in identifying a consumer-based church.
Yes.
People wanted a brand. They wanted a thing.
Yes.
Yeah.
And we identified in that moment, even though, and this was very hard for us because we've been in a relationship with a lot of these people for 20 years.
Yes.
And then you realize that for a lot of people, even though this was not what we were trying to teach at the time, what you were trying to teach at the time, that their sole total relationship with God was what happened in that corporate service.
Yeah, that big service.
So when you start screwing around with the formula, people are coming unraveled because you're messing with their
I
God.
remember that. You did a few services that were on Friday nights. You said we're going to meet on
And then
Friday nights.
the other thing that stands out to me about that is the amazing amount of grace and courage that you had to go with that, because it was, it was not an easy thing. And immediately we saw people kind of start looking for the formula somewhere else. If they couldn't have it here, they were going to look for that band somewhere else.
They'd
They're
find
going to look
another
for that.
church. Yeah.
The other thing I thought that was a tremendous act of grace for us was that this process really took about 1.5 years.
Yeah.
So there was this kind of ramp, either up or down, I guess, depending on how you look at it, where I said, so this first inspiration or first leading or direction would come, which is like, we're going to start consolidating things. Like you said, instead of doing 1.5 hours of music or whatever, we might do more like 20 minutes or 30 minutes or something like that. And then the teaching countdown. And then like you said, we tried actually meeting on a couple of nights. We took a month for the first time and just met on Saturday nights, and that changed things. And we came back.
I remember a lot of the inspiration behind it was, if you've got somebody that's not a believer, and you're inviting them to come to church, well, they maybe don't want to be here for a 2-hour praise-a-thon.
Really?
I mean, they, could God move in a time that is shorter in order to make things more welcoming to people? So
condensed, rich, but condensed.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. And so there was a lot happening there. We weren't all fully aware of what was happening in that moment. But then that began what, a lot of people now refer to, and I think you were the first person I remember hearing the phrase from, but this deconstructionist moment where not just us, but certainly we were living it, where all of a sudden God was disassembling things.
Big experience that everyone had come to
what was that like? What did you see in that moment as you were living through it?
Yeah, the deconstructionist thing, this period that I believe we're still in, this period where you have the church, the kind of mid-sized traditional church, is harder and harder to survive, because the cost of ministry is up, the giving is down, nobody wants to come to it. And at the same time, you have the rise of the megachurch.
Yeah, which is so interesting to me, because it was at the time that megachurches started becoming a thing.
Right.
So my dad, and I'm so proud of this, and I know Mom and our whole family has always been a pioneer and always on the forefront.
Absolutely.
So just about the time everybody else was catching on, Dad would say, I feel God's wind moving differently.
Yeah.
And so everybody else was getting larger, and you were saying, I feel God simplifying.
Another thing that I think was extraordinary for us and that kind of really helped us in that moment was the fact that we had never felt compelled to buy a building, to own a building. Yeah. We never felt compelled to put a bunch of people on staff. So even though we were this kind of a mega church design in the sense that we had all the youth programs and we had the Sunday schools and we had the food pantry and on and on.
Cafe,
no one was on a payroll, really. Yeah. And so in that way, it was not easy, but easier for us to respond to a moment. And saying, okay, we wanted to downsize. We wanted to move downtown from where we were before and all that kind of stuff. And we could do that because in that moment, it was simply saying, we're not going to renew our lease. Right. But if you were in a situation in this deconstructionist era now, where that movement is happening, but you've got a ginormous building and 12 people on salary, making those decisions and being nimble like that and being responsive like that is a whole different pressure. And, as we're, enjoy quoting because of our income level, a poor man here's no threat. So, we didn't have, those decisions were not easy. Seeing people that you've been in a relationship with for 20 or 15 or 20 years leave you for the sake of a formula. Mm-hmm. That was hard. It was hard to see some of those people go. Yes. But we were in a position that we could do that. Yeah. From the beginning of that moment when you felt inspired to meet on a different night, or to do this, or to move to a different location, or try something different, you had all the freedom and nimbleness of our design to do that.
The agility.
Yeah. It was really
packing
amazing.
Light. You always said we're packing light.
Yeah, always a packed light.
Yeah, it's nice not to be burdened down by that stuff. Right. So that was the beginning of a really amazing transition, mm-hmm. and probably the closest to or the start of this chapter where we find ourselves now, even though that was, I don't know, maybe 20 years ago, 15 or 20 years ago.
And I need to interject this.
Yeah,
sorry.
Go for it.
One of the huge components we had of encouraging word in the first megachurch thing was counseling.
Oh, yeah.
Right.
We spent incredible resources on counseling. Yeah. And my wife, Joni, was leading the counseling center, and we had rooms for counseling, and those were full all the time. We had people trained up in counseling, and so many resources going into counseling. Yeah. And yet, I couldn't see any lasting fruit, any results that lasted beyond a flash.
That's interesting.
So, to me, I thought, and since this podcast seems to be sponsored by the word comfort, that people were not comforted by pouring into that, into counseling. Same thing with seminars and crusades and all. They didn't bring comfort. And so all this gets deconstructed. Mm-hmm. Down. Strip away this, strip away that, strip away this, strip away that, till the heart is revealed.
Right.
And the heart is revealed, then people can really see and experience Jesus.
Yeah.
Because nothing satisfies like him.
Right.
Nothing comforts like him. So just throwing things over our shoulder. Yeah. Burning stuff. Tape ministry, everything in the trash, all this. And we sense that we're supposed to move downtown, and that downtown there's going to be some things that are going to be happening, and that we could connect with them. And
and that was interesting because earlier in that we were coming out of that time in the 80s and early 90s, which was totally separatist, which was, Christian culture. We've got to keep ourselves safe. And while you and Mom always taught us to be accepting and loving, we still really had our thing going. Right. And it was, we spent a lot of time at church, and we did this thing, and you started to see, hey, I feel like we need to move downtown to be part of the community, and to be involved and to volunteer and to bring life into the city. Yes. And I remember that being a real revolution. So all of a sudden, instead of hiding out, which we weren't trying to do at all, but what's
now
we're going to come in and
what's unique about that? Other churches, have done things like that before, but they went with the idea of proselytizing, or they went with the idea of fixing, when they went with the idea of getting in. Mm-hmm. When we were in that, we went with the idea of supporting. Yes. We went with the idea of serving. We went with the idea of what can we do to help? How can we flavor this? How can we help with this? Yes. How can we be a part of what you're doing and fit into this thing, as opposed to coming in and finger wagging and doing all that kind of stuff. And a lot of churches
do great things like that now, but at the time it was kind of revolutionary.
Yeah.
We would just go and just be part of things like regular people.
Yeah, just go and find where you can serve and help, and don't be annoying.
Right. Simple stuff.
And in that, the city has been made better.
Yeah. You hit on another thing in there, I think, that is really interesting, in this idea of, in the deconstructionist moment for us, and then simplifying things. And then, so not so much of an emphasis on hours of teaching, not so much an emphasis on putting people into a building every night of the week, not so much an emphasis on even the counseling thing. And yet, so you've removed all that, and and even the thing about youth groups and doing all that kind of stuff. And then you think, but we're not missing any of that. We got rid of it. Mm-hmm. There's no outcry for counseling at that level, the way that thing was, where we were just meeting with people nonstop and nothing was changing.
Right.
There's no outcry for the stuff with youth groups and children's ministries and all that kind of stuff. And so we've been living without that for 15 or 20 years now. And it's like, okay, well, that's not missing. You're not, and so I think that simplification of that is really interesting, because in what we now think is more like I think of now is more like a community, and what we do with our people that meet, when we get together on Wednesday night. We know everybody. The people are really connected to each other. They know each other, and there is a support there, and we're involved in each other's lives well outside of what happens in our quote corporate meeting on Wednesday night. So we're all intertwined in that way, and we know each other that way. And if somebody disappeared for 2 or 3 weeks, you would know. You would where's Donna? Where's Jim? Where's so and so. So widening back out again, where's the church now? I'm not trying to load this question, but where's the church now, and how do you see things that way?
Where the church is now, we're in this deconstructionist period. The mega churches are thriving, and people are leaving traditional churches to go to mega churches because we are consumerism. We're a consumer church, and so that's going on. But then smaller groups, more intimate, more honest. This is on the other end of things. So it seems to be megachurch or smaller, more intimate groups. And being more and more honest. Yeah. Being more and more honest. Being more and more open. Yeah. To me, that's what's going on now. And at the same time, I'm in no way damning, local churches or mega church.
Some great churches.
We have one of the best mega churches around in City Church, and I'd say Spirit Church.
Yeah, but they really affect a lot of people.
Oh yeah, beautiful. Yeah, beautiful stuff. But just the church in our country, the overall picture.
What about the way we think about where we are right now with the what I would say is the intrusion of politics, or this intermingling infusion of politics and religion, which seems to be
on the rise,
really bad right now. But in this conversation of starting back in the 60s and 70s, looking at that, you realize what feels sudden to us or feels dramatic to us right now, where we are, has really been a long ramp.
It is.
And so you can go back and you can start looking in the early 80s, and start seeing this ramp taking off, where the church has always wanted to be. We're like the girl in the middle of the block who wants to be like the rest of the girls. She wants the dresses the other girls have. She wants the cars the other girls have. She wants to go to school and be in the sorority where the other girls are and look like all the other girls. Right. And that's the way the American church is, I think. We've looked at the world and said, I'd like more of that. I want to look like that. I want to be South Tulsa. I want to do those things. And so we've been emulating the world in that way, which is ironic, since we were always telling ourselves we were separating ourselves from But here we are. We look more like the world now than ever before.
Well, we want to be at the cool kids table.
Yeah, absolutely.
But as my daughter, Anjanette, said, now I don't want a place at the cool kids table, but I like to visit. Yeah. And that's a good view. I like that. We're able, by connecting with all people in all ways. Yeah. We're able to visit.
Yes.
But we don't stay there.
Yeah.
So now we see the church kind of getting entangled with things like Christian nationalism, and I think a lot of the other distractions that politics bring.
Yes.
Which I think all those things are easy to see. And what do you believe is the solution to that? What's the response to that? So we have community churches like ours, people who are moved by the Spirit. I mean, what do we do in that scenario, that offers something else that we feel like is more authentic than nationalism?
To me, the only constant is a real deal, interactive, ongoing relationship with God, who is in us and brings comfort. He brings peace in the midst of this. He brings a place of refuge. And so when I am with him, as Scripture says, I desire nothing on earth. So helping people into that personal relationship where God is enough, where he is enough, where there's no place I'd rather be than with him. And that has nothing to do with the church service.
Yeah.
With him and me and him. And, as Jesus said, Father, may they be in us as you are in them. Mm-hmm. And so that saturation, that wholeness, that place, I when I'm in that place, politics, either team, it just makes me want to vomit.
Yeah.
I just think, why, church, you're such a whore. Mm-hmm. You have run after politics because you want to control it. You want to place at the cool kids' table. All of this, it's like fish going after a shining lure, and they just get hooked.
Yeah,
because it's a diversion. It's a distraction. I'm sorry, I'm sort of preaching now. But I have a lot of emotion about that and consternation. And you and I have talked about that.
Yeah,
I mean, how can we, who confessed followers of Jesus, attach in any way to politics?
Yeah.
Well, the idea that one party or the other, depending on who you ask, could co-opt who Jesus is and say, well, if you're a Christian, then you need to vote this way, or vice versa.
Make Jesus their mascot.
Yeah, I mean, that is that's such a dangerous place. Yeah. And maybe it's always been that way, but it seems like in the last, especially 10-ish years, I mean, that's become a real danger where there are people that I think are interested in who God is and maybe want to know more about Jesus, but they see Christianity as becoming this alt-right thing, and they say, well, I don't want anything to do with that. Right. I mean, that's the danger. And we talked about that in one of our other episodes, is the idea that Jesus gets misrepresented so often. That maybe people who really want his comfort aren't even going to seek that at all, because they think, well, if it's that, I don't want that.
Yeah. Well, don't you think that's the reason for the rise in spirituality? There's the reason for the rise in even, Wiccan or anything that has to do with the spiritual comforts or the spiritual
there's a lot of people that are seeking in all these different ways.
Whatever those things are, meditation and calmness and prayer and liturgy of a certain kind, all that kind of stuff. It's all stuff that the church used to provide, but now people don't want to come to the church to get it because they've seen all that, the politics of that. So they want the things that Jesus offers. They can't come to the church to get it, and so they're looking for it in other places. A lot of times. And,
so, do you spend when we get together on Wednesday nights? It's Friday night church on Wednesday.
Right. FNCW.
FNCW. Yeah. When you talk, I wouldn't call it preaching, although you're great at it. I just mean it's always so laid back and genuine and honest, and it's different each week. But you spend a lot of times we talk about what it is like to just live out the teachings of Jesus as a regular person at the grocery store or in your job. I mean, what could you say to encourage people in just being normal people and bringing God's love in everyday life?
Be filled with the life-giving Spirit of Jesus and just simply live your life. God says that he has saved us by his goodness or by his grace and not by what we do, not mixing those two things together. But what now? And he says, for we are God's workmanship, created in his image, to do works which he has prepared in advance for us to do. Even sounds like bad grammar, but that's the wording. He's prepared each of us. We have these appointments through the day. Yeah. And I love getting up every day and suiting up every day. And I've loved ministry more now than I ever have. And it's going that way, ever increasing, more and more excitement about it. Do you sense this? Do you feel that? Do you have this connection? We're bringing this flavor, in the city, these kinds of things. So, I mean, the fact that they're knowing that just as we go, and as if we're aware, we come into a room and say there are 6 or 7 people in there, and the Spirit of God will show you things about the people.
Right.
And he will show you that this one particular guy needs to be encouraged in some way.
Yeah.
And you come up to him, you know nothing about him, but you just know he needs encouragement. And then you realize he's wearing some pretty snappy shoes. And so you say, dude, those are snappy shoes. I really like those. And then he brightens up.
Yeah.
And then it could be that was the appointment because he was getting ready to go to his house and end his life.
Yeah.
You don't know.
Yeah.
Or you come into a place and then say you're having a pint or you're having a cup of coffee, and there's another couple at the adjoining table. You joke about something or about the food or this or that, and then it starts up a little conversation.
Yeah.
And then through that, both of these people are refreshed because they have experienced you who have Jesus in you,
Right.
and they are better off for it, and they want more.
Yeah.
They're left wanting more. And so you may see them later, and then you may get together, and then there may be friendships, and lives may be changed. But none of it happened inside the church building.
Yeah. If you love people, if you identify and connect with the teachings of Jesus, then this is your season, man.
Oh, it is.
There's so much good work.
Tell it.
There's so much good work just to do, just to be done. And, as we are fond of saying, the teachings of Jesus make you look good. The idea of humility, the idea of considering others more important, the idea of complimenting people and loving and putting other people forward and all that stuff.
Being slow to speak.
Yeah. All those things will make you look brilliant.
You will stand out more and more each day.
Yeah.
Because you're looking like Jesus rather than the church or politics or the world.
We've talked about this.
To people.
Jesus. Hey, people love Jesus.
We've talked about this before and in other episodes, but I find it to be so true. We were at a funeral. I was just talking to somebody about this today. We were at a funeral a couple of months ago of a good friend of ours from high school that passed away, and happened to be he happened to be gay. And so he died and from illnesses and stuff. And
this, by the way, would be a great parable of Jesus. If Jesus were writing parables in 2025, what might he say? Please.
So we get to the funeral, and it's Angie and I, and we happen to be separated in the room. It happens to be on the top of this real old school hotel.
Very fancy.
It had a bar and all this stuff, and they were going to do.
He was a violinist.
Like
had
almost
a lot of artsy friends.
Almost a celebration of life or a pseudo wake, actually. And it was really sweet. And we knew some people in the room and everything, and I'm thinking, okay, what's this experience going to be like? And all this stuff, and we're all hanging out, and everybody's enjoying wine and everything else, and then somebody calls it to order, and the thing starts, and I'm not with Anjanette. We're at separate parts of the room because it's so jam packed, we can't quite find each other when the thing starts, and it's just from the moment it starts, there's just this wave. And you feel God in the room. It was amazing. You're just looking around, and it's not just sadness because you're at a funeral. It's not just emotion because you're at a funeral. There's the presence of God, the feeling of God is there in that room. And I'm just struck with this thought because here I am in this world, all of us live in all these little many different worlds. And so I'm there in that moment, and I'm thinking, there are all these amazing, loving, kind, wonderful people who have all this amazing capacity to do good, and they're stuck in a building somewhere else at church. Because they've been told you can't associate with gay people. You're told that this person is not in and you're in and they're out. And so here they're going to go to church, and they're going to just say, well, God, I pray for the world. I just pray, and all this kind of, and I'm just thinking, you could be helping so many people. Michael needed help. Michael needed people to be with him. Michael needed people to deliver food. Michael needed friends and all that kind of stuff. And all these people have that capacity to do that good, and they want to do good, and yet they're stuck in a building somewhere else because they've been told they can't connect with people.
And it was amazing. Here they had a string quartet. It was just beautiful. And you know me, like I have a sensitive heart, so I was trying not to bawl.
Yeah.
It was just because you felt God's presence. So I was, I'm glad I had some Kleenexes with me. It was gorgeous. And then this minister got up, and he was a Baptist minister, which I thought was odd, knowing Michael's situation.
Yeah.
And he looked a little country, actually. He had kind of jeans on and boots. I thought, what's going on? And so Jay and I separately are already feeling God's presence in the room so strongly, separately but together. Like I caught his eye, and I was like, can you feel this? And he, And so this minister got up and he said, I'm not a Baptist pastor anymore.
Oh.
He said, and people like Michael Nicholson, he said, are the reason why.
Wow.
He said, because if I were still a Baptist minister, I would not have been able to love him.
Oh.
And he said, and I loved him.
Oh.
And then I was bawling. I was trying not to, but it was so precious. But then, God's presence was just there.
Oh, yeah.
It was incredible.
Yes.
And if we've ever wondered who's in or who's out or what, none of us know any of these things anyway, like we all think we do. But God was there and his love was strong. And that's where we feel God's presence is out with everyone. Yeah. That's where we find God.
Yes.
Isn't it interesting? Do you feel like God would, in essence, sometimes even remove his presence from churches so that we will get out with people?
Yeah. I went to a funeral in a church building. This is like about 30 years ago here in Bartlesville.
Yeah.
And I'm in there and this is just deader than a hammer. There's nothing.
Sad.
And then God spoke to my consciousness. He says, I haven't been here in years. So.
Yeah.
It's so funny.
Well, here it is. We, talk about stuff from 30 years ago, or more with 1987 and the start of what was then Encouraging Word. And one of the predominant themes was this, conflict between the culture of Christianity and being with the person of Jesus. And the person of Jesus will rescue you. The person of Jesus will lead you into amazing places and amazing adventures and introduce you to people and do all this. And all religion will do is just trap you. And it'll just cut you off and just suck the life out of you. So one thing will fill you with life. The other will just suck you like a vampire and just take everything you have. And now you flash forward to where we are now. And some of that conflict is still the same. I don't identify with the culture of Christianity in America today, especially. Yeah. But the person of Jesus, that's never been more secure. That's never been more beautiful. And like we say, if you love Jesus, if you love people, if you love the teachings of Jesus, there's so much good to be done right now. And and this is your season to do that, man.
Yeah.
And that's it. So,
Dad, you've always modeled that so well, and I've been so fortunate to be, and Jay and I have in so many. But this idea that we are all carriers of God's presence, that He lives within us. The concept that we are the church, that we are out with people. But the idea that when you get up in the morning, as you call it, you suit up and you say, God, what good is there in the world for me to do today?
Yes.
God, who can I love on today? And I know that there was a personal transformation in my life that happened. We grew up but we did in the evangelical movement. I went on mission trips and I would not trade those experiences.
Sure.
And I spent my life thinking I've got to, get people saved and I've got to do this. And it was a lot of pressure for a, type A overachiever. But when the transition came that God calls us simply to love people the way He did and to spread that love, boy, that's freedom. And that's what attracts people to God, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Jay and I were talking one time. We were in a car for whatever reason. We were downtown. I'm driving. Jay's, riding shotgun. It's just he and I. We're talking about some presence of God, comes over us, and I'll never forget it. That that God was speaking to us, and we were just right in front of the ITIO building, and he said, "What would it look like if you lived knowing you were loved?"
Yeah. Right.
So that whole thing. Yeah. So if I live knowing that I'm loved, I don't have a need to fight or to be right. I don't have a need to be heard. I am just satisfied. I am comforted. I'm in His peace. There is nothing that I want. There is nothing that can harm me or hurt me or offend me or cause me to rant. I am whole. I am complete. Now that's how God loves us. Right. And if we as carriers can carry that and infect people with it. It brings change.
Yeah.
It brings change.
Yeah, one thing is what Anjanette describes, and that's a burden. That's a pressure.
Yeah.
I felt that
I
growing
felt
up.
like people were a transaction.
Yeah.
It was something that
Yes.
I was going to love them and show them the way of God, but
then
I
there's-
had to transact some sort of a thing
Yeah.
there.
And then there's this other thing that your dad is describing, and maybe that's for the first time. The illustration or understanding, of Jesus saying, "I have food you know not of."
Yeah.
And this is it, because to do that is a meal, man. To do that is a joy. To do that is not something you have to psych yourself up for.
The idea that, well, you're better at that than me.
Yeah.
That's,
And then try and get yourself all pumped up to go and put it to somebody.
Yeah.
To love people, especially from a sincere standpoint, that's an amazing freedom. That's a joy.
Will you talk about when you came to know God in a more meaningful way when you were 18? What was it that drew you in when you observed that?
Yeah. Well, I think it was it's a similar experience that I think a lot of people have, which is this sense or understanding or knowledge that you're loved, but not just that you're loved, but that you're going to be okay.
Yeah.
That in a moment the fear left. So I was always concerned about what happens when you die. Am I good enough to die? Am I good enough to get to heaven? All those things. You just think, okay, is there any way to know that you're good enough, that you're going to be okay? And so in that awareness of the person of Jesus, the person of God, that fear disappeared, and I knew, I'm loved and I'm going to be okay, and there's a confidence in that intimacy that, as Jesus says so many times, if it were not so, wouldn't I have told you? That's that intimacy in that moment. And okay, it's not that you can't be rocked. It's not that you can't get confused. It's not that you can't, lose some of that on occasion, but in that moment, it was knowing that I was loved and I was okay, and it was going to be okay.
It's his loving kindness that draws us to him. And so if we want to be part of God's work, then I think what we have to do is be carriers of his loving kindness toward people. That's what's going to draw people to him. If anything, if we can have a hand in it, right?
I'm thinking of what our daughter Evangeline prays, which is, God, would you help us to know that it's going to be okay, because it is okay.
Isn't that sweet? She has these little kind of prayers.
It is
she makes
okay.
Up. It's,
and it's very sweet.
That's the comfort that people are looking for.
Yes, that it's going to be okay.
Yeah, and I think that, as carriers of that fragrance, the smell of Jesus, that's the stuff that people get around, whether they're in the church or out of the church. And it is so different than what's happening around us that they say, oh, well, what are you serving? Oh, what do you have? Because this is different. And that's what happened. I'd grown up in a church setting, and they did a lot of good stuff, and all that kind of stuff. But what I smelled and what I sensed and what I felt in that moment was different. Yeah. And I thought, oh, okay, this is a different thing. What is this? Because I would like to have that. And we are carriers in that way, and we can quietly but persistently carry that light, carry that fragrance, carry that freedom. And then people are going to want that because it's so different than everything else they're being demanded to digest instead. So.
And that's what you've modeled, and that's what you've taught us and so many. And the world is different because of that. And, this is just our little secret podcast that we do to talk about this stuff. Yeah. But we do have some people that listen, and some of them in Hawaii, and friends that we know, Austin. And we got an email from a friend of ours that was from high school. It was really sweet. I was surprised that they had been listening. And she said, well, your little podcast gives me hope for the Christian faith, is what she said, which I thought was quite a statement. I was like, but she also knows us for the real people that we are and our failures. But I thought it's so interesting. But I feel like that's how you've lived your life, is people see you and they sense God's presence in you. You've also been, you can have a conversation with anyone about anything because you care, and they're attracted to that because you live out what Jesus did, like for reals. Every day you do it. And it's humbling to try to follow in those footsteps and do that. And
Yeah. Well, I just, that time where he healed my mind and gave it back to me.
Yeah.
And then made sense out of my life and gave me a direction. And that I still feel those things that I felt in that darkness. And I know other people feel them.
Yeah.
And I know that the one who brought me comfort can bring comfort to them.
Yeah.
And he, it's a cliche. I don't know what you're looking for, but Jesus is the answer. Well, the real Jesus, not the church sanitized, American Jesus.
Yeah.
The dress-up doll Jesus, that I used to keep in my office. You can have Sunday school Jesus. You can have, right-wing gun-toting Jesus. You can, have beach Jesus. You can have ethnic Jesus, all that. Whoever you need him to be. But who he is the most beautiful one.
Yeah.
He is the treasure. He is the pearl of great price. He is that one that you go out and you find a field and it has some treasure in it, and then you just go sell everything you have just so you can get back to that treasure.
Yeah.
But that's not to say it in a negative or judgmental way. That hasn't been conveyed, nor modeled, nor lived out in the organized church in our country.
Right.
Yeah. Well, it's hard to monetize that. It's hard to
monetize it.
And to put fear behind it for branding and all that other stuff. And so,
Well,
thank you for all of this and for the perspective, because I think it's really, really helpful.
Yeah, that's pretty amazing. And we'll definitely have you on again to talk about stuff, but it was really neat to hear, your journey. Word gets overused a lot, but in terms of how God found you and the different ways, that he's used you throughout the years. And like we said, we're honored to have been able, and so fortunate. Our life is very different because we've been able to watch you model who Jesus is and try to follow after that. So,
well, thank you.
We're two of many.
Yeah. And thank you guys for listening and being a part of this again. And the podcast you can tell no one about, but you can.
You can. Dad, you can tell people if you want.
If you know people who will, quote, get it and all that kind of stuff that you think might appreciate them.
We call it the speakeasy of podcasts. Someone has to slide you a card with a link.
There's a little share button there. You can copy the link and just text it to somebody, which is great because, most people listen to the podcast on their phone somehow.
Yeah, that's it.
So text it to somebody you think might get this or find it interesting or whatever. And we'll just see where this conversation continues to go. And you can send us your questions, comments, or any of that stuff as well. And all that we really appreciate. And we appreciate you guys being here. So until next time, thank you, Jason Elmore.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Dad. Amazing job.
Thank you, Ann Jeanette, for being an accomplice again. And we will see you guys very, very soon.
All right. See you soon.
Peace out.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this podcast, share it with a friend. And check out Pioneer Dream's other podcast, Dreamers Live, a conversation about living intentionally, and Got a Minute, a podcast that pairs short humor columns with original music.